Go back 30 years, to the early 90s. You're a producer in search of a hit movie. One day, someone hands you a script. You've heard of this guy. He's got a decent reputation. Right now, the characters are just names on the page. They haven't been associated with any actors yet. All you have is the script. All you have is the story. Be honest. Do you buy the script or do you pass on it? That's the question I posed to over a dozen amateur filmmakers, writers, and film buffs. Whether they went yes or no, they had to justify their decision with a reasonable argument. Nearly all of them had seen Pulp Fiction, so it was hard to focus just on the script and forget the performances, the music, and the cinematography. But they managed, to the best of their ability. The most remarkable part of this exercise wasn't hearing the answers, but listening to the reasons for them. I went over these answers, picked out the best 5, and I expanded on them in order to pin down the essence that makes Pulp Fiction stand the test of time. Out of the 5 individuals, 3 decided to buy the script, and the other 2 passed. Now, the first approval came from an independent filmmaker we'll call Robbie. What sold him on the story were 2 particular moments we'll see right now.
You got the idea, taking their wallets.
Mm-hmm.
Now that was a good idea.
Thank you.
You left it at the apartment. You left it at the apartment. It's not your fault.
So, what made these moments stand out? First, that one line, when the Englishman compliments the girl for the idea she had, and then she thanks him for the acknowledgement. It's almost a throwaway moment, the kind that might be deleted to save time because, hey, the plot is not really affected by our knowledge of who inspired what. And yet, the more Robbie took the rest of the script into consideration, the more he came to believe these simple lines were essential to the story. If a movie is to build its appeal on the charisma of its characters, it makes sense to give them endearing qualities, no matter how small. Robbie pointed out a few such blink and you miss moments throughout the story, like Vince choosing conversation topics that he knows Jules will enjoy, or when Jules acknowledges that Vince made a good argument. Even something as seemingly random as Marcellus and Vince greeting each other with a hug. And considering that the bulk of the character roster is made up of criminals and lowlifes, it makes sense to go the extra mile to show the humanity in them, that they care for one another. The peak of that philosophy happens when Butch brings his anger under control for the sake of the woman he loves. We can assume the only reason he's able to switch from violent rage to calm rationality is that he cares about Fabienne. Regardless of how furious he may be, he doesn't want to harm her in any way. Robbie concluded that there's more to Pulp Fiction than multi-layered characters, but we only care about those other things because of the multi-layered characters. And it's easier to be invested in them when they care about each other. He singled out a line that didn't make the final cut of the movie. After Vince diplomatically asks Mia if anything happened between her and Tony Rocky Horror, she says that it didn't. That's in the movie. What's not in the movie but is in the script is Mia saying thanks. Vince asks, "What for?" And Mia replies, "Asking my side." Pulp Fiction resonated with Robbie because of the strong connections between the characters, and that line summed it up perfectly for him. The second person who said they buy the script was Cindy, a creative writing major. Her reason for loving the script will surprise nobody: the dialogue. However, it wasn't just that the dialogue was flashy, memorable, and well-paced, but that it was written with a sense of purpose. Cindy points to the English guy explaining the ins and outs of knocking over liquor stores, These are very specific details that flesh out the character's world, lifting it from a potentially generic setting into something unique and very specific. And this is no fluke either. The same technique comes into play when Binns is listing the cultural differences between Europe and the US, or when Mia is explaining the plot of her failed TV show, or with the wolf's detailed plan for saving Jules and Binns. Cindy used to believe this kind of writing amounted to useless exposition that took time away from the story. She changed her mind when she read The Shining, whose opening chapters offer a detailed account of the infamous Overlook Hotel. She told me, "It's all background information. The hotel's history, its layout, even how the boiler works. It wasn't all necessary for the plot so early in the book, but it did make the setting feel authentic. So I would say it did enrich the story a lot." A story that focuses too much on the plot may keep the audience's interest in the short term, but long term, attention to world building is what makes people want to come back and visit the story world again and again. That being said, scenes with lots of exposition still need to have some drama to come to life. The English guy is not discussing the pros and cons of holding up liquor stores for the fun of it. He's trying to convince his girl with solid arguments that robbing restaurants is a much better career path. Binns is not discussing the nuances of foot massaging for the hell of it. He is hoping to prove his point that Tony Rocky Horror overstepped his boundaries and some form of reckoning was due. Even Mia's recounting the premise of her pilot comes from a desire to bond with Binns by talking about what might be the most important accomplishment of her life. Cindy did concede that not everybody would buy into a movie for the brilliant dialogue alone, but it was an indicator of how pleasantly unpredictable the story could be. It was capable of making even a casual conversation sound adventurous, and that's why Cindy agreed to take a chance on the script. Having gone over a couple positive responses, it's only fair we spend some time with the rejections. The first came from film editor Daisy, whose reason for turning down the script was what she called a lack of narrative momentum. It's not that the story was boring, but in her view, it felt anticlimactic at times. She was engrossed by the diner scene, mostly on the strength of these lines. It rubbed her the wrong way when the main credits got in and a new story got going before the other was finished. It felt odd and disorienting. I want the ride and the destination, but the diner scene just gave me the ride. Still, she got on board with the new story. After all, the dialogue continued to be captivating, and once again the script was building up to something explosive. This time, the setup did lead to something spectacular, so it was definitely an improvement. However, Daisy did find it annoying that the story just seemed to stop after Brett's death, and once again, the script switched to the prologue of a different story, and then put that one on hold and kicked off another story altogether. As much as she enjoyed most of the individual stories, Daisy hated that for their first acts, they seemed to stop just as things were beginning to pick up. Pulp Fiction is her favorite film, but Daisy knew that if all she had to go on was the script, she most likely would have passed on it. If I'm going to get behind the story, I want it to have proper momentum. I guess I want a novel instead of a short story collection. Another damning factor for her was the Gold Watch storyline. While Daisy loves everything from the car crash onward, she finds getting there to be a pain. After an hour of bigger-than-life characters, she found Butch a bit bland. It's only Bruce Willis's casting that gives him some presence. But of course, that doesn't apply to the script. Daisy was also not very partial to the Fabienne character, who feels like a downgrade after Yolanda and Mia. She comes off as too quirky and childlike, more of a fantasy than a layered character. At least someone like Mia had a history, an interest in movies. Fabienne didn't seem to have a life outside of Butch. I didn't like that in the movie, and it feels even more one-dimensional in the script. Daisy admits that rejecting the script would have been a mistake, but that's hindsight talking. There just wasn't enough on the page to win her over. The second rejection came from aspiring screenwriter Gerald, and his reasoning is very clear-cut. He thought it was too slow. He told me this: "I prefer it when stories show people dealing with problems. They can be serious or funny complications, but I need the characters to be dealing with some kind of problem to make them entertaining." Gerald pointed out that it's not until page 53 that a problem with real stakes comes up, and it was only then that his mind stopped drifting off as he was reading. The diner scene had some verbal action going for it, but not much else, and Gerald wasn't happy that it cut off just as the story got into gear. The next sequence involves Jules and Vince confronting Brett and company in the apartment, but that also doesn't pass muster, because they are both in control of the situation the entire time. There's no problem to solve. He says, "It's a cool setup, fine, but I'd rather have tension and suspense instead of just a display of what a badass Jules is." He wasn't much happy with the Vince and Mia storyline either. He had assumed the source of tension would be the sparks between Vince and Mia, but while some chemistry was there, at the end of the day, neither one seemed bent on pursuing an affair. Mia was flirty and passively seductive, but she wasn't throwing herself at Vince. Likewise, Vince kept his composure from beginning to end, so there was low tension throughout the story, and little for Gerald to be engaged by. It did give the script props for making him think the climax of the story would come from the two of them fooling around, only to switch things and have it be Mia's overdose. Things slowed down again with Butch in the cab, refusing to pick up speed until the pawn shop sequence. He found the pacing too indulgent for this one. He did love the final story, as it had two major pressing difficulties to deal with. First, having to race the clock to clean up the car and get rid of a body, and then dealing with the robbers at the diner. Those last 40 pages were thrilling. If the rest of the script had been more like that, I would have bought it, hands down. Gerald acknowledges the writing talent, but he only cared about a small part of it, not the whole package. As such, he felt a pass was the only sensible course of action. The last person who voted yes on the Pulp Fiction script was Zach, an English teacher and film buff. He came into this project with a disclaimer. He likes Pulp Fiction the movie, though he does believe it's admired for the wrong reasons. It's not his favorite film, and he doesn't even crack his top 30. And yet, he respects the movie so much because of the subtle theme it communicates. He wanted to see if this theme was already present in the script before shooting even began. Zach told me the following: "There's a strong theme in Pulp Fiction, and chances are it wasn't even planned." The idea first came to Zach when analyzing the apartment scene where Jules makes a speech before killing Brett. He was wondering how it would read without the voice of Samuel L. Jackson in his head, a task easier said than done. It became evident that without a charismatic performance, the moment could come off as extremely cruel. On paper, Jules doesn't just kill a person who's seemingly harmless, he tortures him mentally and physically before doing the deed. So the odds of being sympathetic are stacked quite a ways against him. With the right actor and the proper setup though, Jules could play the part of a strong-willed man putting someone weak where he belongs. He could be the alpha male that doesn't allow himself to be dominated, unlike puny Brett. Then the script does something remarkable with Jules' character. From a cool, smooth man of action, Jules turns into a punchline as he is sprayed with blood, forced to deal with Vince's childish behavior, and then soaked in cold water while being laughed at. There is no better representation of this role flip than when Jimmy is chewing him out for bringing a dead body into his garage. In the first act, Jules was the big bad wolf terrorizing a big shot wannabe like Brett. Now he is the hat-in-hand beggar who has to take it on the chin when a suburban dude reams him out for putting him in a bad spot. It makes perfect sense for his arc, since Jules' story is the transformation from cold-blooded killer to righteous man. That change makes far more sense after a whole process that forces him to abandon the cool trappings of his big bad wolf persona, leaving just the real man on display. Once Zack pointed all this out, I started to see a similar theme in other parts of the story. More obviously, in the Binns and Mia segment, both of them begin that story playing a role, though it's Mia who's working double time on her character. She is the charismatic, made-for-the-screen mystery woman who likes to play it cool, and it's no coincidence that one of the story's most famous set pieces features her. By the time her story is over, Mia is a pale, sickly-looking shadow of her former self. Quite like Jules, she's been deprived of her cool persona, leaving the real woman on display. Zack also pointed me to the exchange between Mia and Binns when she refuses to tell the awful joke from the TV pilot. Here's where the cool mask begins to crack, because in her mind, the bad joke seems to be a metaphor for her acting career, so sharing it with Binns would break the spell and make her too vulnerable. However, just as Jules chooses to leave his always behind, Mia decides at the end, when she no longer has a mask of coolness to hide behind of, to tell Binns the awful joke. This change of heart is most likely temporary, and chances are, she's already wearing her mask of cool again the next time we see her. But the fact she allowed herself to be vulnerable indicates that the story believes that to be her better self. All of this applies to Butch as well, though perhaps to a less obvious extent. For half of his story, he carries himself like an old-fashioned action hero. Cool under pressure, stoic and poised for anything that comes his way. Then he goes through some brief slapstick comedy, and some action, to rough him up a bit. While it's true that the final act of his story sees him take on the part of a cool, somewhat dashing hero, he does it in service of something greater than himself. I'm not sure if Butch's story lines up with Zack's thematic observations, and even Zack conceded that he might be stretching it a little in this case. To strengthen his argument, he argued that Butch's equivalent of coolness is that he's an everyman for himself type. Apart from Fabian, he doesn't seem to care much about people in general. His reaction to learning he killed his rival is ambivalent at best. On the one hand, he seems to feel bad for the death, but later, he voices a more callous disregard for the dead boxer. To be fair, it could be that these public reactions are just a way of deflecting some of the guilt he might be feeling privately. In that light, it might be that Butch's stoic, lone wolf disregard for others is his own mask of cool. Keep in mind that it's easy to think the lesson of the Watch story from Captain Coons is that the men in Butch's family must do everything in their power to keep the Watch in the family. If you dig deeper though, you see the lesson is more about the selflessness of strangers toward others. Butch's grandfather asked a complete stranger to deliver the Watch to his son, and the stranger, though he had no obligation to comply, took on the burden. The next link in the chain is Coombs, who protected the Watch when Butch's father was no longer able to do so himself. It's not the Watch itself that's important, but how it brought out the best in these men. Butch gives up his mask of cool when he decides to go back and save Marcellus Wallace. It's no longer about him. It's time he lived up to the legacy of his forefathers and the men who helped them. For a while at least, he is something greater than just the unfazed hero. To Zack's credit, it was a very compelling case, and it did seem to tie the story together. It also helped to explain the story's structure. The first half is about showing the main character's cool personas, and the actual stories are about dismantling that image and trying to get a feel for the real person underneath. There's an important theme about how we can go on living our lives wearing masks of cool, but might have them taken away from us in crises. Sometimes they come back on. Other times, hopefully, we decide to embrace our better, truer selves. Perhaps this theme was completely accidental. Regardless, there is enough of it in the story to suspect Tarantino and Avery meant to communicate all this. All the arguments made by my friends were compelling and provided plenty of food for thought. As for me, would I have passed on the script for Pulp Fiction? I must admit there's a high probability I would have. While I do think it's a fun script, I didn't see much beyond the spectacle of its catchy dialogue and cool characters. However, if I had talked with Zack first, I would have snapped up the script in a heartbeat. He perceived the hidden strength underneath, the depths that catapulted the story into something much stronger than just a couple of hours of fun at the theater. He was able to perceive the art behind the showmanship, the thematic complexity woven into the spectacle. He saw that the story wasn't just flash, it had a soul. I think the cool factor is what still draws so many people to the movie 30 years on, and it's probably what keeps them around. But I think many fans also respond to that subtle thematic strength the movie possesses, even if the fans aren't always able to put it into words. And it's always been right there, in the script. If there's one big lesson to be had here, I believe it is that if a story is to become fantastic, first it must find something important to say, and then develop a unique voice in which to communicate that idea. Easier said than done, I know, but coming up with a great story is never easy. It sure is worth it though.